Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode of Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. And tonight it gives me great pleasure to welcome my very special guest and namesake, Mohamed Ashraf Chohan, an advocate, a senior advocate, who practices at the Johannesburg Bar. Mohamed Ashraf, assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you very much.
Tonight we have a very, very interesting topic. And I'd like Mohamed Ashraf to actually introduce the topic. I would ask, in the first place, what is CAGE and what are its objectives?
Ashraf, thank you very much. I'd like to start off by explaining, firstly, why CAGE, which is an organization that has recently been launched in South Africa last week, Friday, has taken a pivotal importance in South Africa and in the rest of the world. It has its origins as a result of the war on terror, which, as you will know, commenced shortly after 9/11, and when many people across the world were then incarcerated, imprisoned in various camps, one of which you will all know is called Guantanamo Bay. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, is that many of these people have been imprisoned, have been incarcerated without any rights being afforded to them, without any due process. Many people are unknown to the outside world.
Right.
And so, as a result of that, CAGE began as a body, as an advocacy group, in order to highlight the plight of these individuals, in order to show the world that there are people out there who have been incarcerated, who are lavishing in prisons without due process. CAGE's role in that regard is largely to do reports.
Right.
So in other words, it will go out, it will investigate. Is there somebody that has been incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay?
Right.
Who is this person? Why is he there? How long has he been there? To inform his family about it, to produce reports about his status, and of course, what has happened to him, so that people know that there is an individual out there, just not a number,
Right.
and that from there, further steps can be taken by other organizations who can perhaps assist that individual.
Right. Now, before we started, we were just chatting that every system of law operates within the paradigm of a limitation, a rule of law. A rule of law is a limitation on the ultimate law. You're saying something very interesting. Please expand on that.
Well, let's start off on the general premise. Every country, every jurisdiction in the world has what is called the rule of law. It is a limitation or a restriction on the exercise of arbitrary power. Implicit in that is a recognition that someone, a state invariably, a government, will exercise power over others.
Right.
Invariably, its citizens. And if it were allowed to exercise that power arbitrarily, well, the net result of that is going to be anarchy, injustice. And so man-made laws were introduced to temper that exercise of power.
Right.
And they do it by a precept of rules, what we now understand as the rule of law, but they are essentially restrictions on how the exercise or how the power should be exercised.
Right.
An example of that is in a country with the rule of law like ours,
Yes.
where we have a constitution, which includes the Bill of Rights.
Right.
And you have the right to a fair trial, you have a right to dignity, etc.
Yes.
And those are what one would traditionally call the basic rules of law.
Right. So those are the freedoms that you enjoyed.
Those are the freedoms you would enjoy as I say, in a secular
Right.
society. Muslims, of course, their law, or their divine law, comes from Quran
Right.
and Sunnah. And it has, if not the same but better
Right.
rules
Yes.
in relation to how one conducts oneself
Right.
vis-a-vis others, how one conducts oneself vis-a-vis prisoners.
Right.
And so one takes as your benchmark,
Yes.
firstly as Muslims, what the Quran and Sunnah say,
Yeah.
and secondly, insofar as non-Muslims are concerned, what the rule of law is in your jurisdiction.
Right. So what is it that CAGE does specifically?
Look, the CAGE was introduced or set up in the United Kingdom.
Right.
And as I said, it came about largely because of what occurred after 9/11.
Yes.
Its main function, and I must stress this, is it's an advocacy group.
Right.
So it's not a legal body, although many lawyers participate in trying to assist in
Right.
the organization. But its primary function is to provide reports
Yes.
and to make the public and the world aware of the plight of these individuals.
Right.
So it would, for example, ascertain who has been incarcerated in a particular prison,
Right.
find out their details, investigate why they are there, how long they have been there for, and try and then assist those individuals by, of course, referring them on to other organizations, lawyers, organizations who would assist in trying to get them released.
Right. Now, what is the status of Guantanamo? And I mean, there's another part to that, but let's just deal with how CAGE is involved in the Guantanamo issues shortly. But what is the status of Guantanamo? How is it that the United States has a bit of Cuba, if I may just put it that way?
I think it started some time back, if memory serves me correctly, and that Guantanamo Bay is a part of Cuba which is currently being leased
Right.
by the United States for a nominal sum.
Right.
And because it is, and there's a base there, as we know, situated in Guantanamo Bay, because it is not part of Cuba, it doesn't fall within their jurisdiction. And of course, because it's not in the United States, it doesn't fall or part of or subject to
Right.
the United States Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Guantanamo Bay is nothing more than a concentration camp. It's not a prison, where people have been held for inordinate periods of time without due process.
Yes.
They haven't been charged. No trials have been given to them, and they've been left there at the discretion of the power, of the very power that we've been speaking about earlier, entirely at their discretion.
Right.
I think shortly after 9/11, Guantanamo Bay, perhaps at its peak, may have had about 700 prisoners, individuals who have been incarcerated. At present, I think there are probably about 150 that still remain in Guantanamo Bay.
Right.
So although there has been a reduction, it still remains open for business, and there are still people who have been incarcerated there.
So has there been an addition to the number of people there, or is it just people are being released?
People have been released.
Yes.
And I would like to think that they have been released on account of the various campaigns that have been undertaken by bodies such as CAGE,
Right.
such as Amnesty International, and various other liberty organizations that are across the world.
Now, some of the prisoners were involved in a hunger strike as well in order to bring some attention to their plight. And I think we resonate in our own country of the rights of prisoners. If we just have to think back to the dark days of apartheid, where people were incarcerated on Robben Island for a considerable period. And although Robben Island fell under a civilian authority, I think the difference is Guantanamo falls under a military authority.
Well, there's a big difference. Most people who were incarcerated on Robben Island were afforded a trial.
Right.
They were heard. They were found guilty under laws at that stage that made their acts
So there was a
subject to
law.
terrorism. So there was a rule, and it was followed, rightly or wrongly. So Guantanamo Bay doesn't have that.
Right.
There are no rights that are afforded to these individuals, and according to the Americans, the reason for that is because the Geneva Convention, which would apply to prisoners of war, do not apply to these individuals. And they've categorized them as enemy combatants.
Right.
But it's a fancy word for a person who you are incarcerated.
So basically the Geneva Convention doesn't make provision for a so-called enemy combatant, correct?
On that interpretation by the Americans, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, what is CAGE's position on the rights of the prisoners held at Guantanamo Bay?
Well, there again, CAGE, as I said, its main function and objective is to highlight the plight of these individuals.
Right.
So knowing that they have not been afforded due process and that they remain incarcerated without a trial, CAGE's objective is to promote, perhaps to report on these individuals and to make available to the world on its website the status of these people.
Right. Now, one hears the word black sites. What do we understand by what is a black site?
A black site is a camp, a holding, a prison. You can call it what you want. Its location is secret, where people are detained without the right or due process being afforded to them. Now, why black sites are important and why CAGE Africa in particular was launched in South Africa last week is because it came to their attention that there have been a number of black sites that have either been operating in Africa, and or which and the rest of the world as well, and which are likely to increase.
Right.
So places like Somalia, places like Morocco, places like Egypt. Investigations conducted not only by CAGE but by various other reporters have uncovered the existence of these sites. But unlike Guantanamo Bay, where you now know who is incarcerated, the difficulty is, firstly, you don't know where these sites are, and secondly, you don't know who's been incarcerated there.
Right.
So the person who's languishing in that prison has no one to assist him, because no one knows he's there.
Right.
And it's a part of CAGE's core function to try and identify that individual, to make a connection with him and his family, and to raise his plight to the world.
That sounds like a very, very difficult task. I mean, how have the lawyers and other professionals played a role in the so-called war on terror?
Well, again, there are two parts to it. There are those lawyers, those professionals who seek to uphold truth, haq, who seek to uphold justice, and who will then try and assist. And there are various bodies and various organizations that do that. There are others who have played a role on the other side, who have sought to subvert the truth, who have sought to subvert the justice. And in Guantanamo Bay, which is a classic example, I recall there was a documentary on Al Jazeera, I think perhaps a few weeks back, which I had seen, which demonstrated that the medical profession in America played a significant role in the war of terror. Primarily by assisting and developing techniques for torturing prisoners. Lawyers, they played a similar role. They would obviously give legal opinion on whether or not these techniques were legitimate. And so you have a divide between those who seek to advance injustice and those who seek to avert it.
Right. And Ashraf, I'd ask you to take a breather there. We're going for a short break, and please stay tuned to a very interesting topic, and we'll see you after the short ad break. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another portion of Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. And as I've stated earlier, my very special guest tonight is Mohamed Ashraf Chohan, an advocate, a senior advocate practicing at the Johannesburg Bar. And tonight we're discussing various aspects of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. One of the questions that we were discussing just before the break was, how have lawyers and other professionals played a role in the war of terror? And Mohamed Ashraf was talking about how certain doctors and other professionals might have been complicit in the war of terror. But on the other side, you have CAGE, an international organization, and you have CAGE Africa, just been recently launched. Now, Mohamed Ashraf, what has CAGE Africa or other organizations been able to do specifically with regard to the prisoners there?
Ashraf, wa alaikum salam again. There have been a number of reports since CAGE UK first came onto the scene dealing with prisoner rights, especially in Guantanamo Bay. One of the, and perhaps the best way to illustrate this is to give you an example. You may all have heard of an individual by the name of Sheikh Abdul Salim Zaif. He was an ambassador to Pakistan for the Taliban prior to 9/11. And whilst he was in Pakistan, he was abducted and taken to Guantanamo Bay, where he was incarcerated without a trial and without any due process for at least 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he was subsequently released, and I understand he is now residing in Afghanistan. But one of the difficulties is, whilst he was there, he was subjected to torture.
Right.
And the torture that he was subjected to was both physical and mental torture.
Right.
Techniques such as waterboarding, techniques such as sleep deprivation, these were all sanctioned by the officials presiding over Guantanamo Bay, up to the highest level, where the lawyers participated in determining whether or not these techniques were legitimate.
Right.
And I recall a story that he tells, and he's written a book, My Life with the Taliban. I recall a story where he says, for 1 month, he was not allowed to sleep. He had to stand up in his cell, and every time he dozed off to sleep, they would come and hit him. This was a technique of theirs to try and reduce his willpower. The next month, they would lock his hands together, and it would remain like that for a month.
Sure.
Now, this was just one individual.
Mm-hmm.
There were over 500, 700 individuals there, each having their own stories to tell. He tells a story that whilst he was there, I think, there were 2 prisoners that caught his attention. And the reason for that is because of their age. Now, it's mind-boggling, in fact, to think that there was a prisoner at Guantanamo Bay who was 105 years old.
Sure.
And you've got to ask yourself, as a Muslim, as a lawyer, whether you're a human rights lawyer or otherwise, on what conceivable basis is a 105-year-old man languishing in Guantanamo Bay without being given the opportunity to say or give his side of the story? The other individual was a boy of 12.
Right.
Now, these are precisely the reasons why other jurisprudences have developed the rule of law.
Right.
It's so that decisions as to whether or not somebody should be abducted or imprisoned aren't taken arbitrarily, that there is some due process. And it is in that context that CAGE, both CAGE UK and hopefully, inshallah, CAGE Africa seek to exploit. their focus, apart from bringing the attention of the world to these prisoners, to these individuals, is to try and get their release.
Right.
If they are there, they haven't been given due process. Some of them have been there for more than 10 years. It is our duty, firstly as Muslims, to ensure that we do everything that we can to assist them.
But on a practical level, I mean, how can people help Cage?
There are, I think, many ways in which they can do so. Of course, Cage Africa has just recently started.
Right.
So from a practical level, what it is looking for at the moment, as I understand it, are people to assist them with research, caseworkers,
right,
if I can put it that way. People who would be willing to take on a project and do the necessary investigations.
Right.
This is time consuming, it is difficult, but it has been done.
Right.
And the Cage UK is an exemplary example of that.
Right.
So that's the first area. The second area, of course, is to spread the word.
Right.
That there are Muslims, there are other people languishing in prisons, in concentration camps without the right to be heard, and so that there is a public awareness
right.
of it, and that steps can then be taken. Hopefully, those who are in power see the error of their ways and would see reason and would release these individuals.
And look, it appears on each or most of these occasions that a lot of these prisoners that were rendered to Guantanamo were taken forcibly. So I think we had two cases in this country that we're very familiar with, that of Khalid Rashid, who was illegally rendered. So there was a rendition of Khalid Rashid and it made it to our courts. And our rendition's actually legal.
Yes, Khalid Rashid is a very good example. Unfortunately, although it was dealt with by our courts, it was dealt with in a different context.
Yes.
If I recall, it was dealt with in the context of a breach of immigration laws.
Yes.
We're not talking about immigration laws, we're talking about a rendition.
Yes.
I term it, it's a synonym for kidnapping.
Right.
Individual is in a country, you get hold of him, you blindfold him, you bundle him into a car, and the next time you know it, he's in Guantanamo Bay,
right.
or he's in a different country. There's no extradition right, obligation. There was nothing asked of the government in terms of formal extradition process. So it has happened in South Africa. As I've said, there are a number of black sites that various reporters and newspapers have identified in the rest of Africa. And so the likelihood of these renditions happening are great.
Right.
And by and large, the bulk of individuals who have found themselves in Guantanamo Bay have arisen as a result of renditions.
But clearly renditions cannot be legal. Because there doesn't appear to be an underlying law that allows you to remove it. I think one of the things that you mentioned was there had to be an extradition treaty for it to have been done legally.
I'm no international law expert, but it just seems to me logically to be clearly unlawful.
Right. Now, what has Obama and Bush done in the war of terror? How is it that Guantanamo has come up? How is it that all of these things that never existed before 9/11 have suddenly made their appearance?
Remember, as a result of 9/11, the Bush administration declared the so-called war on terror. What it did was it expanded the geographical boundaries
right.
of the United States' reach. Whereas previously it may have been confined to the United States only, now there was no geographical boundary.
Right.
There was no limitation. Anyone, anywhere was subject to its power.
Right.
And that's where your renditions come in. If they suspected you of being complicit in or having participated in any act of terrorism as they've defined it, then you were a likely candidate for rendition. You were kidnapped and taken to Guantanamo Bay or any other of the black sites. So what the Bush administration did was it expanded its reach.
Right.
And of course, as we know, Guantanamo Bay was open during that era.
Right.
And the Obama administration has done nothing less. In fact, it's done worse. If we look at it, what the Obama administration has done is it has now legitimized assassinations, not only of American citizens, and the famous story you know is of Sheikh Anwar al-Awlaki and his son, but of other individuals through the use of predator drones.
Yes.
So one can see that the rule of law, which jurisprudence had dictated, was the fundamental to any society, is being ignored.
Right. And I'd ask you to please stay tuned to us. We're going for a short ad break and we will see you after the... Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the last part of Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. And my very special guest tonight is Advocate Mohamed Ashraf Chohan from the Johannesburg Bar. And we were having a discussion on the rights of the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, amongst other topics. Just before the break, we were talking very importantly on what can be done to assist the prisoners and how you could interact with Cage. And part of the answers was that researchers were needed. Then we moved on to the topic of the Obama's efforts in the war of terror. And I think Bush referred to it as the war on terror, Ashraf. What do we understand by these terms? Well,
yes, you're correct. It was referred to by the Bush administration as the war on terror. But as I think I've been able to graphically demonstrate by at least the one example,
yeah,
it in reality is a war of terror.
Right.
People are being terrorized, people are being kidnapped, people are being held in concentration camps without due process, without being heard. It is, in its very terms, a war of terror. And that's where bodies such as Cage, such as Amnesty International, and various other human rights organizations, not necessarily Muslim organizations, yes, have embarked upon an investigative role to unearth this terror and to put it out to the world and to show the policies and the acts that have been committed by countries like the United States for what they are.
Just a reminder to our viewers that our lines are open and you're welcome to call in. As always, the number is 011 086 7700 1, 2 or 3. The number appears on your screen as well. Ashraf, we were talking earlier on about where you could be rendered, illegally rendered, and you could end up in a black site. I mean, that looks like a scenario where you completely disappear off the face of the earth. Do we know where these black sites are?
Well, can I just step back,
yes,
for a moment? We in South Africa generally have been isolated, either because of our political position pre-apartheid era, or simply geographically because we find ourselves at the tip of the continent.
Right.
But make no mistake that we are in a continent that is currently being utilized,
right,
for these very acts. Black sites, according to the Washington Post,
yes,
as far as I recall, exist in countries such as Bucharest,
right,
Romania, There's a villa in Poland, according to that article,
Right.
As well as one in Bangkok.
Okay.
So that's the world. In Africa, as I've said, I think earlier, they exist in Somalia,
Right.
in Morocco.
Somalia, amazing, a country torn by war and
Yes.
terror itself,
So,
is hosting a
so
black site.
these are parts of the continent not far away from us.
Right.
And we shouldn't be complacent into thinking, well, because we are in South Africa and because we're on the tip, it can't really happen here.
Right.
As you've said, there have already been 2 examples
Yes.
of it. So I would urge your viewers to, for example, look at the CAGE website. Have a look at the articles
Just
that have
on
been
that
written
point, there's a caller on the line. Caller, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum
there.
salam.
Salam.
I just want, sorry, is it okay if I stay anonymous?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. What I need to know is, can South African lawyers do anything for Guantanamo Bay?
That's your question. Hello?
I repeat.
We've got your question. Can South African lawyers do anything for Guantanamo Bay? Ashraf?
Yes.
Let me just
Can I
emphasize.
hear over air?
Certainly. Thank you for your call.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for your question. Can I just emphasize that CAGE is not a lawyers organization and doesn't render any litigation assistance to prisoners of Guantanamo Bay. It is an advocacy group that is aimed at raising the plight of these individuals with the aim, inshallah, of having them released. But coming to your question of whether or not South African lawyers can play a role, I think that lawyers across the globe can play a role in making representations and in assisting the prisoners once they have been released, either in seeking compensation or in ensuring that they have, once they are released, sort of put back in position where they were before.
I think the difficulty is you can't get directly involved in the legal proceedings because this is almost like a military court, and the prisoners themselves have been given attorneys and lawyers appointed by the Americans themselves for their defense. So there isn't an active participation as defense lawyers. I mean,
I don't think there's any court that you can go to as South African lawyers
right.
and put up your case for an individual.
But you could certainly get involved in other means. You
Yes.
can assist with research, you can assist in other means. But I think from what you said, CAGE itself is not a litigation unit.
No.
It is a research unit. We have another call on the line. Hello?
Hello?
Hello, please go ahead.
Yes?
You're on.
Senior advocate. Yes, senior advocate. I wish to play devil's advocate here. It covers almost both grounds, one in Israel and the one in America. As soon as people are attacked in such a way that a number of their persons are destroyed. Like, for instance, in Israel, 600 million Jews were destroyed by Hitler. And when we go over to America, that issue where planes were taken and driven into those towers. Do you not think now, senior advocate, that as a country, as a government of a country, there is going to be a massive reaction, even though they are going to do away with the normal rights which we see in a constitution?
Okay, thank you for your call.
If I understand your question, it is whether or not as a result of the 9/11, a government is entitled then to take the steps that it has taken in kidnapping various people across the globe and putting them in Guantanamo Bay without due process. I think one just needs to state the position to see the obvious. Whatever may have happened at 9/11, it certainly doesn't give the United States or any other country the power to unilaterally remove somebody who may be innocent of any crime and to hold him without trial for a period of 10 years or 3 years or 1 year. And that's really the emphasis is, has the American government in its policies acted improperly, unlawfully, and is there anything that we as Muslims, certainly as Muslims and as other organizations, can do to raise the plight of these individuals?
Mohamed Ashraf, regarding the prisoners themselves, do we know anything about them? Are they do they come from different denominations? Are they like Christians, all in Guantanamo Bay? What do we know about the prisoners?
As I understand it, Ashraf, all of the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay are Muslim.
Oh. Isn't that a bit surprising?
Given the Bush administration's policy, no.
So some say then the war on terror is really a war on the Muslims.
Yes, and rightly so, I would think.
So I think we have another call on the line. Caller, please go ahead.
Hello.
Hello, yes.
Yeah, still I'm online. I want to ask a question.
Yes, please go ahead. We can hear you.
Hello, how are you?
Fine, thanks. And you?
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead. We can hear you.
Yeah, I want to ask a question. First, my name is Abdurrashid Somalian. I want to ask one question.
Yes.
And how can Israel apartheid government striking Gaza Strip? How can they get against it or illegal from Hague International Court?
Abdul Rashid, sorry, can I ask you, please switch off your TV or put down the volume. I cannot hear your question.
Okay, can I repeat that question?
Please repeat it, yes.
Okay, and Israel government, they strike Gaza Strip and they kill innocent people, women, children, and elderly. And they say that the International Criminal Court, how they can face that criminal court like Gaza.
So if I understand your question, Israel has killed innocent women and children, and there is an international criminal court.
Yeah.
How can we take Israel to the International Criminal Court? Is that your question?
Yeah, that's
Okay, thank you for your question. Ashraf?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. As I said, I'm not an international law expert, and it falls outside the remit of CAGE's objectives, which I must emphasize is not a litigation body, but an advocacy group.
Okay, let me try and assist with an answer there. The International Criminal Court was established in The Hague. There are certain signatories to its conventions. Neither the United States and, as far as I know, Israel are signatories to this, or the Palestinian Authority. In order to successfully prosecute the atrocities allegedly to have been committed by the Israeli government, the Palestinian Authority would have to ratify the convention and then lay a claim with, I think her name is Fatima Ben Sudu, who is the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor there. So it'll require certain practical steps to be taken before a claim could be launched at the ICC. But thank you very much for your question. Ashraf, just regarding what we were speaking of, I think there was a play. I understand that we have to go for a short break. Please stay tuned with us, and we will see you on the other side of the break. And thank you and welcome back to Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon to legal ease. We're in the last quarter of the show, and if you still want to call, you are welcome to call in on 011-086-7700. My very special guest tonight is Advocate Mohamed Ashraf Chohan. And we were talking about the various aspects regarding Guantanamo and Cage Africa. Mohamed Ashraf, with regard to Cage Africa, is there anything else apart from due process, or do we look at due process in how these prisoners are dealt with?
Remember, it starts off with due process.
Right.
So initially, you would have an individual who was incarcerated without being afforded the usual rights that one would have expected.
Right.
To be heard, to have a fair trial, etc.
And to know what charge.
And to know what charge.
What are you facing? What is the charge against you?
Correct, so that you can deal with it if necessary. So that's the first step. But increasingly, one would expect that with the amount of attention being drawn to the lack of due process by organizations such as CAGE, such as Amnesty International, and various other liberty organizations in the world, that these governments would soon realize that they're walking a tightrope.
Right.
And that they should now start perhaps affording theoretically due process.
Right.
The battlefield then, it seems to me, would then move from due process to substantive law. And that's where anti-terror legislation comes into play. Now, we're all familiar with it.
Yes.
We've seen it in South Africa during the apartheid times.
Yes.
Various anti-terror legislation was introduced. And this is legislation that is specifically designed to cover a group, a particular group or a particular act or conduct.
I'll ask you to just pause there. We have a caller on the line. Caller, please go ahead.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
First of all, may I give you my opinion on this?
Yes, please go ahead.
I would love to call this a travesty of justice. And I would like, with your permission, to extrapolate on the type of torture methods that are being used by the perpetrators of the torture on these prisoners that they are keeping. It is known in medical terms as it causes diseases that frequent flyers eventually start to suffer from. It leaves no physical marks on the actual prisoners, but they continue with it until the prisoners eventually start suffering from sleep deprivation. They start getting physical diseases like diabetes, insomnia. Some of them start suffering with insanity and even leading as far as suicide. So I definitely think that if you can do something about this, and I repeat that I think it's a travesty of justice, something must be able to be done to stop this.
Well, thank you for your call, and thank you for enlightening us on some of the effects of extreme torture on prisoners. I'm certainly shocked that it could actually lead to a physical disease. But thank you for your call.
I think travesty of justice is putting it quite elegantly. And what you refer to, the torture, is the mental torture that has been meted out to various individuals at Guantanamo Bay.
Mohamed Ashraf, we were just touching on the topic of legislation, anti-terror legislation that seems to have been very popular around the world now.
Yes.
we in the southern tip of Africa, and you were saying earlier on, we appear to be very isolated from events. Are we also headed the same way?
There is a piece of legislation, as I understand it, that deals with anti-terrorism in South Africa. I don't think it has yet been promulgated, but I stand subject to correction.
Right.
But by and large, it's those countries, the United States in particular, United Kingdom, where who have been at the forefront
Yes.
of the war of terror, that have now seen fit to introduce these pieces of legislation. And as I say, the idea there is to overcome the difficulty that they have in relation to due process. So they will now afford you due process, so you can't complain about it.
Right.
But having gone through that, you immediately fall into the trap of the conduct or the type of conduct that has now been enshrined in the anti-terror legislation. Right. And what is terrorism will be dictated by the person who's drafting that piece of legislation.
And on that interesting note, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave a very, very interesting subject. I thank you for having made yourself available tonight, and to the viewers and to our excellent team for tonight's efforts. Thank you for having joined us on Legal Ease. Don't forget to join us next week, same time, same place, for another episode of Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam.